So motion blur allows us to create the visual effect of a camera, as if a camera were taking video footage or film footage of our object as it moves across the screen. So here is a basic animation that starts off fast and ends up slow with no motion blur on it. And you can see that it just moves from left to right and then slows down. Now if I want to give this motion blur, then there's two steps that I need to take place. The first is that I need to assign this particular layer blur with motion blur, and you'll see that there's a little icon there for motion blur, and directly below that is a checkbox. I check that box. Now all that does is it says this layer will receive motion blur, but only when I have selected to enable all of the layers that I want to receive motion blur. So it's a two-step process. You assign a layer or a number of layers to receive motion blur, and then you click the large motion blur icon at the top. It looks at all of the layers that currently have had motion blur assigned to them and then enables the motion blur. And you can see the effect then up here. So if I just go back kind of frame by frame, you can see very clearly that the motion blur is taking effect here on my text. And motion blur, because it adds the kind of filmic or photographic look to our objects, we tend to at this stage equate photographic with realistic or natural, so that the motion blur effect is used quite a lot to make things look a little bit more natural, a little bit more organic. But all we're really doing is we're adding the process of shutter speed control to our effects, and I'll talk about that now in a little bit more detail. Now motion blur isn't just one kind of a one-trick pony out of the box, give it motion blur, assign it, and it's over. You can control the amount of motion blur also, and you do that in a per composition basis. So my comp 1 here that contains my blur, if I right click on that and go to composition settings, I get all of the stuff that we saw when we first opened up After Effects. Familiar looking stuff, the preset, the frame dimensions, pixel aspect ratio, frame rate, etc. and so on. But in the advanced tab we have the motion blur settings. Now I'm just going to talk about this one setting here, shutter angle, because this is the important one, and this is set to 180 degrees. Now I'm just going to pop out of After Effects and into Wikipedia, good old Wikipedia, which has a very good page describing what shutter angle is. Now shutter angle goes back to the old film days, where you had film stock passing through the gate, and you had to have some way that the film camera would allow a certain amount of light to hit that frame of film whilst and exposing it essentially. And what it used was this rotary disc shutter method. So you can see the rotary disc here is essentially like a kind of a circular device that rotates around, and you'll see that while it's open it allows light to hit the film, and while it's covering or closed over the gate you'll see that it's not allowing light to hit. Now the angle of the shutter refers to how open or closed that particular device is. So at the moment you'll see that it's completely flat on one side, which gives us the indication that it has a shutter angle of 180 degrees. Now 180 degrees tells us that for half the amount of time that that frame is in the gate, it's going to be exposed with light. And if we're working off a kind of a 24 or 25 frames per second system, then 1/2 of that is 1/50th of a second. Now 1/50th of a second is kind of like a magic number when it comes to shutter speed, and basically all we're doing is we're converting shutter angle here to shutter speed, and we're going from 180 to 1/50 or 1/50th of a second, in that is kind of the accepted amount of motion blur that looks natural, looks normal, looks filmic, if you want to call it that. Anything slower, you're adding an effect. Anything faster, you're adding an effect. So 1/50 or 1/50th of a second or 180 degrees is kind of the de facto normal motion blur. And the page here gives a good detailed explanation of that, and it essentially says that normal motion blur is where the frame rate is twice the duration of the exposure rate. Okay. Now, all of that said can be boiled down simply into saying that in After Effects, now I'll just close that for a second so I can bring it back to a point where there's more blur, and then go back into the settings, composition settings, advanced, and you can actually see that when you close the shutter angle and you'll see it update, you'll see the blur start to become reduced. Now, any photographer will know that when you speed up the shutter speed or allow for a quicker exposure, you're going to capture sharper movement. So it's like taking that picture of the guy or the person jumping in the air with a 1/1000. They're perfectly sharp in the air. If you took that at 1/25th of a second, you'd see just a ghostly blur of the person jumping up in the air. And that's essentially what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with reduced shutter angle. Just think of shutter angle as shutter speed. Lowering the shutter angle will give you a faster shutter speed. Increasing the angle will give you slower shutter speed, and you can really bump that up to 360, which will give you a total blur. Okay, so you can change blur, you can make it blurrier, you can make it sharper, you can go for more subtle kind of motion blur. Depends on aesthetics and taste, and that is essentially the motion blur.